Wyoming's high desert stretched endlessly under a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon whole. Daniel Crawford had learned to read this land the way some men read books, understanding its moods and warnings through subtle shifts in wind and light. On this particular morning in early September, something felt wrong. The air carried a stillness that made his weathered hands tighten on the reins as he guided his horse along the northern boundary of his property. 45 years of life had carved deep lines into Daniel's face, each one a testament to hard-won survival in country that forgave nothing. 20 of those years had been spent building this ranch from nothing, transforming barren ground into something resembling a home. He had arrived with empty pockets and desperate hope, much like countless others who came west seeking transformation. But unlike most, Daniel had found what he searched for, though the cost had been measured in loneliness and loss. The ranch house stood simple and functional against the morning sky. 2 rooms of solid timber with a stone chimney that leaked smoke on windy days. Beside it sat a sturdy barn, a chicken coop, and the various outbuildings that marked a working cattle operation. Nothing fancy, nothing wasted. Every structure served its purpose with the efficiency that frontier life demanded. Daniel had been checking fence lines when his horse suddenly stopped, ears forward and alert. Years of trust between man and animal made Daniel immediately scan the landscape for whatever had triggered this response. At first he saw nothing unusual, just the familiar arrangement of rocks and sagebrush that characterized this remote corner of his land. Then movement caught his eye near a cluster of juniper trees. 2 figures lay partially concealed in the morning shadows, their forms so still Daniel initially mistook them for fallen logs. But his horse knew better, and Daniel trusted the animal's instincts more than his own aging eyes. He dismounted carefully and approached on foot, one hand resting naturally near his rifle though he made no move to draw it. The figures resolved into 2 young women, Apache by their dress and features, collapsed in exhaustion at the base of the largest juniper. Both appeared barely conscious, their clothing torn and dusty from hard travel. The older one, perhaps 19 or 20, had positioned herself protectively over the younger, who looked to be 17 or 18. Dehydration had cracked their lips and sunburn darkened their exposed skin beyond its natural tone. Daniel knelt slowly, making his movements obvious and unthreatening. The older woman's eyes fluttered open, dark and alert despite her obvious weakness. She assessed him in a single glance, calculating threat levels with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to danger. Her hand moved slightly, perhaps reaching for a weapon she no longer possessed, then fell back as her body betrayed her intentions with its exhaustion. Water came first. Daniel unslung his canteen and offered it without words, holding it where she could see but not forcing proximity. After a long moment, she reached for it with trembling hands. He helped steady the canteen as she drank, then woke her companion with gentle touches. The younger woman responded slowly, emerging from unconsciousness with the confused fear of someone unsure whether waking meant safety or new danger. They shared the water between them, while Daniel assessed their condition with the practical eye of someone who had seen both animals and humans pushed to physical limits. These women had been traveling hard with insufficient supplies, probably for several days. Their feet showed through worn moccasins and their clothes bore the stains of someone sleeping rough without shelter or adequate food. From his saddlebag, Daniel retrieved strips of dried beef and hard biscuits, standard trail rations that would be easier on empty stomachs than regular food. He placed these within reach and stepped back, giving them space to decide whether trust was worth the risk. The older woman examined the food carefully before allowing her companion to eat, taking small bites herself only after determining the provisions were safe. Daniel returned to his horse and stood with apparent casualness, though his mind raced through complications and consequences. Apache presence this far into settler territory was unusual and problematic. Relations between the tribes and incoming settlers had deteriorated badly over recent years, with violence and forced relocations creating deep wounds on both sides. Any rancher discovered harboring Apache runaways would face serious repercussions from neighbors and possibly military authorities. But Daniel remembered his own arrival in this territory, remembered the desperation of being young and lost with nowhere to turn. Someone had shown him unexpected kindness then. A grizzled trader who had given him work and taught him survival skills without demanding explanations. That debt could never be repaid directly, only passed forward to others in similar need. The sun climbed higher as the women slowly regained enough strength to sit upright without support. Daniel waited patiently, letting them set the pace of interaction. Eventually the older one spoke, her English broken but understandable, learned from mission schools or trading posts. She gave her name as Aida, and identified her companion as her sister Elu. They had been separated from their family during a military sweep of tribal camps, scattered by soldiers intent on forced relocation to reservation lands. The story emerged in fragments, pieces of a larger tragedy. Daniel could only partially reconstruct: families divided, traditional lands seized, promises broken by government officials who had never intended to honor them. Aida and Elu had been traveling toward distant relatives when their supplies ran out and exhaustion finally stopped their flight. Daniel faced the decision he had been avoiding since first spotting these women. He could give them food and water, point them towards safer territory, and send them on their way. This would minimize his risk while still offering some assistance. Or he could take them to his ranch, provide real shelter and recovery time, knowing this choice would eventually draw attention he could not afford. The younger sister Elu met his eyes, and Daniel saw something that made his decision inevitable. Not pleading or manipulation, but simply exhausted hope that one more person in this hostile world might choose humanity over expedience. Her expression reminded him of his late wife Sarah, who had possessed that same quality of seeing potential goodness in others, even when circumstances suggested otherwise. He gestured toward his horse, and then toward the direction of his ranch. The meaning clear, without need for complicated explanation. Aida hesitated, clearly weighing whether accepting this offer was wise or walking into a different kind of trap. But survival instincts eventually overruled suspicion. She nodded agreement and helped Elu stand on unsteady legs. Getting both women onto his horse required careful maneuvering, but their combined weight was manageable for the sturdy animal. Daniel took the reins and began walking, leading his horse and its precious cargo toward his ranch. The journey took nearly 2 hours through rough country, time Daniel used to plan the complications ahead. His nearest neighbors were the Hendersons, 5 miles east, decent people but nervous about Indian troubles. Frank Harrison's spread lay 8 miles south, and Frank had loudly proclaimed his views on tribal peoples at every town meeting for years. News traveled slowly in this scattered community, but it traveled inevitably. Daniel estimated he had perhaps 2 or 3 days before someone noticed the extra mouths at his table and started asking uncomfortable questions. The ranch came into view as afternoon heat reached its peak. Daniel's small collection of buildings looked humble after the morning's drama, but to the two exhausted women they apparently represented something closer to salvation. He helped them dismount near the house, noting how both moved with the careful stiffness of bodies pushed beyond reasonable limits. Inside, the house was clean but Spartan, containing only essential furniture and items that served clear purposes. Daniel had never been one for decoration or unnecessary possessions. The main room held a table, chairs, a wood stove and shelves for supplies. The smaller bedroom contained his bed and little else. He gestured for the women to take the bedroom while he quickly assembled basic comforts: clean water for washing, blankets, a basin and cloth. While they cleaned up, Daniel prepared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and cornbread. Nothing fancy, but substantial and nourishing for bodies requiring restoration. He had learned cooking from necessity after Sarah's death 5 years earlier, developing competence rather than skill in the kitchen. The food would fill stomachs, even if it won no prizes for flavor. Aita and Elu emerged looking marginally more human after washing away layers of trail dirt. Daniel served the meal without ceremony, and they ate in silence. The tension of strangers sharing space without established trust. But it was not an unfriendly silence, merely the careful quiet of people assessing new situations. After eating, exhaustion finally claimed both women completely. Daniel showed them the bedroom and then retreated to the barn, where he would sleep for however long this arrangement lasted. The barn was familiar territory anyway, and he had spent enough nights there over the years that comfort was relative. He settled into the hay with his rifle close and his mind churning through scenarios. The following morning brought harsh reality into sharper focus. Daniel rose early from habit and found his guests already awake, sitting outside in the morning sun. Elu looked marginally better after food and rest, her eyes clearer and movements less pained. Ada maintained the watchful alertness of someone whose survival had always depended on constant vigilance. Daniel needed supplies from town, routine provisions that could not be postponed without drawing attention through absence. But leaving his guests alone felt risky in ways he could not fully articulate. He explained the necessity, and they nodded understanding, clearly planning to remain hidden inside during his absence. The ride to town took 90 minutes through country growing familiar from 20 years of repetition. Pine Ridge consisted of one main street, with essential businesses, a general store, blacksmith, church, saloon, and scattered homes. Perhaps 300 people called the area home, most living on surrounding ranches and homesteads, small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. Daniel tied his horse outside the general store and entered to find proprietor Joe Henderson sorting supplies behind the counter. Joe was a decent man, honest in his dealings, and fair with credit. They exchanged greetings, and Daniel placed his order, selecting items that would not suggest extra mouths to feed. But small-town shopkeepers noticed everything, and Joe commented on the increased quantity of certain staples. Daniel deflected casually, mentioning plans to work longer days and needing extra provisions on hand. Joe accepted this without obvious suspicion and began assembling the order. Meanwhile, other customers came and went, and Daniel picked up fragments of conversation that increased his worry. Talk centered on recent Apache movements in the territory. Apparently, a military patrol had been tracking a group of runaways who had escaped forced relocation. Tensions were running high, with settlers nervous about possible raids and soldiers increasingly aggressive in their pursuit. Several ranchers had organized informal patrols, positioning themselves as defenders against threats both real and imagined. Frank Harrison entered the store, while Daniel was settling his bill. Frank cut an imposing figure, tall and broad with the bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. He had lost family members to tribal raids years earlier, and his hatred had calcified into permanent suspicion of all native peoples. His eyes found Daniel immediately, and he approached with the kind of purpose that suggested agenda rather than casual conversation. The exchange remained superficial but carried undercurrents of implied threat. Frank mentioned the runaways, speculated about their possible locations, commented on the importance of neighbors standing together. Daniel responded with non-committal noises that could mean anything or nothing. Frank's eyes studied him with uncomfortable intensity before moving on to other customers. Daniel completed his business and departed, aware of eyes tracking his exit. The ride home felt longer than usual, weighted with knowledge that his actions had set events in motion that he could not fully control. Whatever happened next would involve complications extending far beyond his ability to manage alone. Aida and Elu were waiting anxiously when he returned. They had heard horses passing in the distance and feared discovery. Daniel reassured them while unloading supplies, but his mind was already working through next steps. These women needed time to recover strength before attempting further travel, but every additional day increased the risk of exposure. That evening, Daniel asked Aida about their plans. She explained their hope of reaching relatives in distant tribal lands. Perhaps 2 weeks' travel north under good conditions. But reaching that destination required supplies, horses, and enough recovered health to survive the journey, none of which they currently possessed. Daniel found himself offering assistance. He had not fully planned to give. He could provide food and supplies, could even spare a horse once they were ready to travel. But getting them safely beyond settled territories would require careful timing and probably some deception about their movements. The complications mounted with each consideration. 3 days passed in careful routine. The women remained mostly hidden while regaining strength. Daniel continued his normal ranch work, maintaining appearances of ordinary activity, but the tension built like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. He knew from experience that this kind of precarious balance could not last indefinitely. The break came on the fourth morning when Daniel discovered fresh tracks around his property, evidence that someone had been observing his ranch during the night. The tracks were made by unshod horses, suggesting either tribal scouts or settlers deliberately trying to appear as such. Either possibility was concerning. That afternoon, a group of riders appeared on his land without invitation or warning. Frank Harrison led 5 other men, all armed and displaying the aggressive confidence of those certain their cause justified any action. Daniel met them in his yard, rifle held casually, but ready. The confrontation remained outwardly civil while radiating potential violence. Frank claimed reports of Apache in the area and demanded to search Daniel's property. Daniel refused, citing property rights and personal autonomy. The standoff escalated until Frank's patience evaporated and he announced his intention to search anyway, law or no law. Ayita and Elu had heard the commotion and emerged from the house despite Daniel's earlier instructions to remain hidden. Their appearance confirmed everything Frank had suspected and transformed the situation from tense to explosive. Frank's men raised their weapons and demands were shouted, but Daniel positioned himself between the women and the mounted men, making clear that any violence would have to go through him first. Frank's face showed triumph mixed with rage. He announced his intention to take the women into custody, claiming authority he did not legally possess but felt entitled to exercise. Daniel countered that these women had broken no laws and were guests on his property by invitation. The legal argument was weak, but it bought moments while everyone recalculated their positions. The tension broke in an unexpected direction when one of Frank's men, a younger rancher named Tom, suddenly spoke up questioning whether they had actual authority for what they planned. This created a fracture in Frank's united front as other men showed reluctance to cross clear lines into kidnapping or worse. Frank rounded on Tom with fury, but the damage was done. Doubt had entered the group dynamic, and Frank's absolute authority had been challenged. 2 other men quietly moved their horses backward, subtle but clear signals of withdrawal from whatever Frank intended next. Outnumbered but not defeated, Frank issued threats about consequences and legal repercussions before leading his remaining loyalists away. But Daniel knew this represented delay rather than resolution. Frank would return with greater force or involve actual authorities, and either outcome would mean serious trouble. That evening Daniel and Ayita discussed reality with painful honesty. They could not stay, and they could not leave safely through normal routes. But Ayita revealed information she had withheld earlier. Her brother was a respected warrior who traveled with a small band in the mountains to the north. If they could reach him, real protection became possible. This changed calculations significantly. Daniel made a decision that surprised even himself. He would personally guide the women north, using his knowledge of backcountry routes to avoid both military patrols and settler pursues. The journey would take perhaps 10 days through difficult terrain, and his absence would certainly destroy whatever remained of his standing in the community. But the alternative was abandoning these women to certain capture and possible death. They departed before dawn the next morning, traveling light with only essential supplies. Daniel led them through country he had explored during his early years in the territory, routes too rough for wagons, but passable for determined travelers on horseback. They moved cautiously, avoiding main trails and settling areas, camping without fires and keeping watch in rotating shifts. The journey tested everyone's endurance, pushing through weather that alternated between scorching days and freezing nights. But gradually they covered distance, moving deeper into tribal lands where settler presence thinned toward non-existence. Daniel's knowledge of the country proved invaluable as they navigated difficult passages and found water in places that appeared barren. On the 8th day, they encountered Ayita's brother and his band. The meeting was tense initially, with warriors understandably suspicious of a white rancher traveling with 2 Apache women. But Ayita's explanations and Daniel's obvious care for their safety gradually overcame hostility. Her brother, a man called Standing Bear, questioned Daniel extensively about his motivations and intentions. Daniel answered honestly, explaining the circumstances that had brought them together and his unwillingness to abandon vulnerable people to their enemies. Standing Bear listened without visible reaction, then conferred with his warriors in their own language. The deliberation seemed endless, Daniel's fate hanging uncertain in the mountain air. Finally, Standing Bear approached and spoke in careful English. He acknowledged Daniel's assistance and offered safe passage back to his ranch under the band's protection. More significantly, he extended friendship and promised that Daniel would be recognized as someone under Standing Bear's protection. This carried weight in ways Daniel only partially understood, but he recognized the value of such alliances in country where enemies far outnumbered friends. The parting with Aida and Elu carried unexpected emotion. These women had entered his life as problems to be solved, but had become something more through shared adversity. Aida clasped his hand and spoke words of gratitude that seemed inadequate for what had passed between them. Elu simply embraced him, an impulsive gesture that bridged cultural divides through simple human connection. Daniel rode back toward his ranch, accompanied by 2 Apache warriors who would ensure his safe passage through tribal lands. The journey home felt longer than the outbound trek, weighted with knowledge of what awaited. His ranch would likely be damaged or claimed by others. His standing in the community was certainly destroyed. The life he had built over 20 years had been sacrificed for 2 strangers. But as he rode through country painted gold by setting sun, Daniel felt something unexpected. Peace, not the peace of a man who had avoided trouble, but the deeper peace of someone who had faced an impossible choice and chosen according to conscience rather than convenience. Whatever consequences awaited, they would be faced with that same bedrock conviction. His ranch appeared on the horizon 3 days later, still standing but showing signs of interference. Fences were down in places and several animals were missing. But the house remained intact and his essential possessions undisturbed. Frank Harrison had apparently vented anger through property damage rather than complete destruction. Daniel spent the following weeks repairing damage and re-establishing his routine. Though nothing felt quite the same. Neighbors who had been cordial now avoided him. Town merchants served him, but conversation remained minimal and cold. He had become an outsider in his own community, suspect for his choices and dangerous association. But other changes occurred more gradually. The 2 Apache warriors who had escorted him home remained in the area, establishing a camp in the mountains and occasionally visiting to check on his welfare. Other tribal members began appearing. First cautiously, then with increasing confidence, seeking trade or information. Daniel's ranch became an informal meeting point between 2 worlds, neither fully trusting but willing to test possibilities. One morning, several months after his journey north, Daniel found a gift left near his door. A beautifully crafted knife with a decorated sheath, clearly valuable and made with extraordinary skill. No note accompanied it, but Daniel understood. Aida and Elu were safe, had reached their people, and wanted him to know the knowledge brought satisfaction disproportionate to the simple gift. Years passed, and the territory changed around Daniel. Treaties were signed and broken. Lands were seized, conflicts erupted and subsided. Through it all, Daniel maintained his strange position as someone trusted by neither side but respected by both. His ranch became known as neutral ground, where honest dealings could occur without the weight of tribal or settler politics. He never remarried, never rebuilt the community connections he had sacrificed. But his life contained purpose and meaning that transcended simple material success. The 2 Apache women he had chosen to help were now mothers themselves, raising families in lands their ancestors had occupied for generations. They occasionally sent word through Standing Bear, letting Daniel know they remembered and honored his choice. Daniel grew old on his ranch, his body slowing and his hair turning white. But his eyes retained the clarity of someone who had found his answer to life's essential question. What kind of person would he choose to be when tested by impossible circumstances? The answer had cost him dearly in conventional terms, but had purchased something more valuable than community approval or material comfort. On his final day, many years after that fateful morning when he had discovered 2 exhausted women on his land, Daniel sat on his porch watching sunset paint the mountains in shades of fire and gold. Standing Bear sat beside him, both men now old and weathered by time. They spoke little, as was their custom, finding communication in shared silence. Standing Bear eventually rose to leave, but paused at the porch steps. He spoke in English, wanting Daniel to fully understand the words. The story of Daniel Crawford would be told around Apache fires for generations. He said, told as proof that honor and humanity could exist anywhere, in any heart willing to pay the price. The white rancher who had risked everything for two vulnerable women he had never met would be remembered when kings and conquerors were forgotten. Daniel nodded acceptance of these words, but offered no response. He had never acted for recognition or remembrance, but simply because conscience demanded certain choices regardless of consequences. If that choice rippled forward through time and memory, then perhaps the cost had purchased something truly lasting. The sun completed its descent, and darkness claimed the valley. Daniel remained on his porch a while longer, at peace with the life he had lived and the choices he had made. He thought of Sarah, who would have understood and approved. He thought of Aida and Elu, now grandmothers teaching their own grandchildren about kindness and courage. He thought of all the small moments that accumulated into a complete life. In the mountains, wolves began their evening songs. Closer to the ranch, Daniel's horses stirred in their corral. Somewhere in the darkness, the land continued its eternal patience, outlasting all the dramas played across its surface. And in that moment, everything seemed exactly as it should be. Imperfect, complicated, but fundamentally true. Daniel Crawford died peacefully in his sleep that night, a man who had made impossible choices and lived with their consequences without regret. His grave was marked by a simple stone, but his true monument existed in the stories told by people who had learned from his example that sometimes the bravest act is simple human decency in the face of overwhelming pressure to abandon it. The ranch eventually passed to others, and then faded into history as settlements grew and times changed. But the story persisted, changing slightly with each telling but maintaining its essential truth. When two vulnerable strangers appeared on a Wyoming rancher's land and impossible choices had to be made, one man chose humanity over convenience and honor over comfort. That choice cost him everything, by conventional measure, but earned him immortality of the only kind that truly matters. The kind that teaches generations about what human beings are capable of becoming when they refuse to let circumstances define their character.